question. And this happens in manufacturing, imperfect competition, but it does not happen in agriculture. And this is why the European Union and the United States heavily subsidize their agriculture. Right? So agriculture is useful for employment and it's useful for a lot of things, but it cannot alone raise the wage level of a country. And I think the proof of the pudding is the heavy subsidies that goes into agriculture both in the EU and in the United States. But these subsidies come from somewhere, right? They come from the industrial sector to the agricultural sector. This is just to give you an impression of how different economic activities are. This is the United States, 1899 to 1937. You see one industry there to the left, the output increased by 200,000%, and the wage earners per unit of product, that is productivity, went down by 89%. So this very important link between increase in output and increase in productivity. So the car industry there was incredibly important, and all countries understood they needed a car industry. You know, Japan had 23 car companies in the 1920s. Right? So the strategy has been to grab the economic activities with the highest growth potential, which also gave the largest productivity. The productivity is the length of the lines under zero, the wage earners per unit of product. And on the right-hand side, you have mature products, you know, gloves and locomotives and sleighs and carriages, with no productivity increase and no wage increase. So the secret of economic development has been to keep as close to those high productivity industries as possible. Today, of course, it's information technology, and tomorrow is going to be something else. But economic development is always concentrated in a few activities, and this picture only serves to show you diversity, you know, how different economic activities are. And the problem with neoclassical economics, the ruling economics, is that they do not wish to see the difference between different economic activities. I found scattered, but I started going back in history because I disagreed with present economics and found that economics in the old days was different. I found statements like, of course we all know that the real gold mines are not the gold mines but the manufacturing industry. First professor of industry of economics in Sweden, 1742. Where did he get it from? And you find all these statements about the importance of industry scattered around, and I found that they all come from this Italian author, Giovanni Botero, in 1588 was the first edition, on 3 books on the causes of the greatness of cities. Why on earth is it that wealth is concentrated in cities? And out of this book came in 47 editions through the 1600s. This is in all European languages. And this was the basis of economic development, that it was activity specific and it was specific to manufacturing industry. So here is a quote, the power of industry that no mine of silver or gold or in New Spain or Peru can compare with it. Italy is a country, at the bottom there, Italy is a country where there is no important gold or silver mine, and so is France. Yet both countries are rich in money and treasure thanks to industry. Because people had observed that all the gold that went into Spain caused deindustrialization of Spain. Much in the same way that you find countries in Africa countries get deindustrialized because of oil. So I think you should be happy that you don't have oil, because that's the risk. So this understanding was there for a very long time, and it disappeared only in the early 19th century, and then it came back. So this is cyclical. And here is a map of the here is a map of the people from Botero there, the ideas coming out of the Renaissance in England, in Italy, in France, and in Germany. And this is the family tree of the economists who think like I do today. And it's an unbroken line from the Renaissance, whereas neoclassical economics starts with Adam Smith in 1776. This is a much older tradition. So these are the dead economists that I tend to agree with, and you find that Marx is there, but also Schumpeter, who was very conservative. So this is independent of the right-left axis. So economic activities, if you look at it over time, you have certain productivity explosions. We already saw the one in car industry. This is the one, the early one in the first industrial revolution. This is the productivity increase in cotton spinning in England. So you see, it was more than 25% a year. If you look at the computer industry in the 1990s, it looks like that. There's something called Moore's law in computing, where the productivity of the silicon chip doubles every 18 months. And that has happened since the late 1970s. And then you get a curve like that. And the countries that get into those activities also manage to raise their standard of living. Same thing, seen from a different angle, a learning curve. You see that in the United States, to produce a pair of shoes in 1850, it took 15 and a half hours. In 1936, 0.9. So what tends to happen is that rich countries export where there is a lot of learning. You know, in the 19th century, the United States was actually exporting shoes. But when the learning curve flattens, the poor countries tend to take over export. So rich countries export from where there is a lot of learning, and they import from where there is little learning. Right? So that way, they can maximize their growth. So the trick for a poor country is trying to get into a couple of these very high learning activities. And sometimes, you know, the link between industry and civilization was this is before Adam Smith, was, I think, importantly expressed. From manufacturing, you may expect the two greatest ills of humanity, superstition and slavery, to be healed. That's quite a powerful statement. And I think this replies to superstition in any religion. And I don't want to talk too much about religion here, but I deal with the Muslim Council of Singapore. They translate my book and they publish my articles. You know, the Muslim Council of Singapore is very different from the Muslims in the deindustrialized deserts, right? So, and I also had a chair in Malaysia, and I could observe, you know, how different Kuala Lumpur is to the East Coast, and they will, you know. So there's something about the type of manufacturing, the type of activity you have, will heavily influence society at large. And when Europe discovered the rest of the world, or when the rest of the world discovered Europe, you know, people knew this. Francis Bacon would say that what you produce will shape your society. We have a new mystery now. A couple of days ago, Bloomberg View, the typical American household is $4,000 poorer than it was in 1999. So the new mystery is now that also the rich countries are getting poorer. And this is because, as we see here in the case of the United States, wow, this is going berserk. Oh, how can we stop it? Oh, you see what I expressed here as the 40s wage regime. You see productivity and wages keeping pace, so that the workers get their share of the productivity increase, so that the relationship between capital and labor stays the same. Right? Labor has the same percentage of the pie. How can I deal with these when they're out of...
Just go on next slide.
Yeah. This is a bit surrealistic that they move in opposite directions. So I'll talk to the right hand side. Okay.
Yeah. I got it.
Oh, okay. Well, this is the next. This is the case of Peru, where you see exports going up, industry dying out, but exports are going up, and wages are going down. And this is the case of Russia, which is very complicated, but you will see here that index of industrial production goes down by 50%, agricultural production goes down by 50%, wages go down by 50%, but the ruble skyrockets. Speculations, oil, we don't know. But we see here that this is August 1998, collapse of the ruble, wages collapse, but then they start
Kazançdan mikrofonunda kondusu tuzda ismi.
industrial production, agricultural production, and labor and wages start climbing. And this was the result of the shock therapy, right? And I was surprised when I was invited to Russia to a conference a year and a half ago, and there was also Mr. Jeffrey Sachs, who was in charge of this shock therapy. And he was still seen as some kind of expert that they trusted. So I think it's very important that all the countries that suffered this shock understand what actually happened. You know, it was a severe case of deindustrialization, and it was the result of the shock therapy. After that came the oligarchs and all those problems, but the problem wasn't the oligarchs. The problem was the situation that was created with deindustrialization, and these companies, you know, even before they knew their costs, even before they had a cost accounting in place, they went bankrupt. And I think this is important to understand. If you look at, I've tried to compare some countries. Armenia, unfortunately Georgia isn't on this, but you see Armenia, 30.4% was industry, and then in 2001 it's down to 14%. You know, it's very dramatic. And you see some other countries like Hungary and Czechia are doing well. So, if you look at the Middle East, the war in Iraq in 2003, GDP of Iraq was already down from 7,000 to 1,000. And we tend not to analyze these. When we see the political disasters, we tend to forget about the problems of economic structure that went behind political problems. So I'll try to convince you that capitalism and communism was much closer than we think. That capitalism and communism depended on the same economic strategy. These are two steps, from West Germany and from East Germany. And they had one common hero, Mr. Friedrich List, who was a German economist who wanted two things: industrialization and infrastructure. Right? And he was a common hero of both communism and Western capitalism. So they were, in that aspect, very similar. They were both these systems wanted industrialization, and in both systems this was forgotten after 1989. And if we look at the link between the West and the Bolsheviks, it is Mr. Sergei Witte, minister under two last Tsars. He translated Friedrich List into Russian, and the Bolsheviks took over Witte's strategy. They actually took over. The Bolsheviks actually took over the bureaucracy of industrialization that had been placed there by Mr. Witte. So when the Russians in the 1930s asked themselves, what are these Bolsheviks doing? Well, they're essentially doing the same thing that Mr. Witte tried to do. Right? So I think this is important, and this is where we have to go back. We have to go back to that understanding of Mr. List and Mr. Witte, that economic structure is the key to development. And there's another important aspect of that, is that the economic structure of a country decides the population carrying capacity. In a hunting and gathering society in the Amazon, 1 to 2 persons per square kilometers is a lot. In an agricultural society, 40 persons is a lot. When Eritrea went from 40 persons per square kilometers to 50, they started exporting people. Right? But when the people in Eritrea come to Holland, where there are 400 people per square kilometers, they get a job. I mean, the ability of a country to feed population depends on, not on food production, but on the economic structure. And I think it's very sad for a country like Armenia, and to some extent I guess also here, that the most important export item becomes its own people. And if that idea, if that is something you want to avoid, exporting a lot of people, well, the answer is not in food production, the answer is in economic structure. Only nations with a large manufacturing sector are able to feed a large population. And interestingly enough, famines are normally only found in nations specializing in agriculture. You have the case of Latvia. Latvia got deindustrialized and 20% of the population left. If we industrialize Ukraine, 20% of the Ukrainian population may also leave, and 20% of the Ukrainian population are more than 8 million people. Right? And I think these are the things that the European Union does not consider when they consider free trade. And this forgotten important understanding, it was reinvented after the World War II in Germany, when the Americans and the Allies wanted to punish Germany and prohibit manufacturing industry. Then Herbert Hoover, the ex-president, was sent by President Truman to Germany because he understood there was a problem there. And this phrase in a letter from Hoover to Truman is very important. There is an illusion that the new Germany, left after the annexations, can be reduced to a pastoral state without industry. It cannot be done unless we exterminate or move 25 million people, Germans, out of it. Right? And in 3 months, the US government changed from deindustrializing Germany to creating a Marshall Plan. This was the idea of the Marshall Plan, to avoid creating 25 million refugees from Germany, to make it possible for the Germans to have a living in their own country. And of course, there are very many similarities here to what's happening today in the Middle East. That the deindustrialization creates these problems. So this is what today's economic models tend to miss. Paul Krugman, an important economist, says it very clearly. I think there's a pretty good case to be made that the stuff that I stressed in the models is a less important story than the things I left out because I couldn't model them. So what I'm trying to put in here are factors that Mr. Krugman couldn't model in his mathematical models, but are still very important. And I think they are being rediscovered. So, one of the recommendations for this country would be, add value to your own raw materials. Greece is a big producer of olive oil, but a lot of that olive oil is sold in bulk to Italy, and Italy exports it to the rest of the world. So most of the value added is actually in Italy and not in Greece. Right? There's similar cases in this country, I think, with walnut oil or many other raw materials. And here is where the state comes in. The small producers of olive oil or walnuts cannot themselves put up the industrializing bit that's needed to produce the value added. So here is one example where the state comes in. So this is an interesting quote from 1558. From the raw materials from Spain and the West Indies, particularly silk, iron, and cochinilla, which cost them only 1 florin. The foreigners produce finished goods and sell them back to Spain for between 10 and 100 florins. So let's say Greece exports olive oil in bulk to Italy. The Italians refine it and put it in small bottles and sell them back to Greece for 10 or 100 times more. Right? This is the manufacturing multiplier. And Ortiz, the Minister of Finance, writes to his king in 1558, Spain is in this way subject to greater humiliations from the rest of Europe than those they themselves impose on the Indians. In exchange for gold and silver, the Spaniards offer trinkets of greater or lesser value, but by buying back their own raw materials at an exorbitant price, the Spaniards are made the laughingstock of all of Europe. You know, when Adam Smith writes 200 years later, this is all forgotten, but it tends to get rediscovered again. Right? And I'm saying this is the time to rediscover it. The United States has been an important industrializing country. But in the United States, there has been a very important gap between rhetoric and reality. I mean, you find that in many countries, but in the United States, it's particularly marked. Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, said that the best government is the government that governs the least. Right? And this is what we hear from the United States. But actually what the United States did was to protect its industry for a long time. I mean, up until the early 20th century and then again in the 1930s. So the big hero in my book is Alexander Hamilton, the first Minister of Finance of the United States, who grew up in the West Indies with slaves. And he understood that the only way to get rid of slavery was to introduce manufacturing. Right? So what's happening is that the United States has a rhetoric of Jefferson, but the practice is Hamilton. Right? And the Americans used to say, don't do as the English tell you to do as the English did. And I think we should say now, don't do as the Americans tell you to do as the Americans did. And the interesting thing is that now they are rediscovering Hamilton. There was a movement to get on the banknote in the United States, and they wanted to get rid of Hamilton, and there was a popular uprising, and they decided to get rid of Jackson instead. And it's interesting that this important president, he is on the $2 bill. Has any of you seen a $2 bill? Oh, very few people have. But the prominent $10 bill was given to this man who was given president. Right? So there is some symbolism in this. So neoliberalism created lower growth. So the peak here, this was already alluded to in the introduction, the peak here was from 1950 to 1973. This is Africa, this is Latin America, this is Eastern Europe, this is the former USSR, and this is Asia. Right? So I think the former USSR, or those who belong to that geographical area, should learn from Asia. You know, the Asians did something right, obviously. And I think we should try to emulate Asia. We should try to see what is it that they did right, and what is it that we in our different national contexts can learn from Asia. Adding value to raw materials is the starting point, but also different manufacturing activities are important. So, the economy is a system, and there are virtuous circles where different factors reinforce each other in a positive spiral, and there are negative spirals. So, the Marshall Plan idea is that you catch the productivity increases which are not distributed to all economic activities. There are technological dead ends. If that leads to higher wages, you're on a good track. But if you are in agriculture, you normally have to lower the export prices at the same rate as productivity increases. And then you are out of the system because there is no real wage increase. So if you get higher real wages, you get higher demand, higher savings, higher possibilities for taxation, which will lead to better health, education, etc. And very important, and this is what we tend to forget, that when wages go up, it becomes profitable to introduce new technology. This is very often not seen. So the irresponsible wage increases in a place like Italy in the 1970s actually had a very beneficial byproduct of creating higher wages, which again introduced new technologies. Right? And we see the opposite. For instance, now in Norway, we see that productivity in the construction sector is falling because it's cheaper to import cheap labor from Poland and let the cheap labor carry the building materials up in the building rather than installing an elevator. A lift is now, a lift used to be cheaper than labor, now labor is cheaper than lifts and productivity falls. And this is becoming a problem in the West. So, large scale of production, you get highly diversified economies, you get systemic energies, and you get higher investments, higher profits, economies of scale and scope, which brings costs down even more, higher capital labor ratio, and also interestingly, we see in countries with high wages that fertility tends to fall. Fertility falls when people are desperately poor, like the Inuits and the Eskimos in Canada, then fertility falls, but fertility also falls when people get richer. So I think, if I was in Africa, and my wife and I needed 3 children to keep us alive when we get old, because there's no social security. If infant mortality is 50% and you need 3 children, how many children should you have? Well, I would say 6. Plus perhaps adding a margin of security of 1, right? So this is just an example, but I think if we're worried about high fertility in some parts of the world, well, industry cures that as well. So, and then of course this feeds back, and these are the virtuous circles of economic development. And this is what the Marshall Plan created, and this is also to some extent what the industrialization, of in the Soviet system. In most post-Soviet countries, the standards of living were higher under communism than afterwards. Right? And that's not because communism was such a good system, it is because it's better to have an inefficient manufacturing sector than not to have any manufacturing sector at all. It's a bit like saying it's better to be an inefficient lawyer in Tbilisi than to be the most efficient person washing dishes, right? So it's better to have an inefficient manufacturing industry, and the sad thing is that the manufacturing industry has been killed off to a large extent. And then I think we should face what to do with it. Some services behave like industry, yes, but the advanced services tend to require demand from the manufacturing sector. So we're still back to the importance of building some manufacturing sector. Well, to finish off then with the vicious circles, this is what the Morgenthau Plan, the deindustrialization plan of Germany, was supposed to create, and which was stopped. If you engage in production of technologically mature products and projects subject to diminishing returns is what you have in agriculture when you extend the area where you produce. You normally start with the best area to produce, and then you extend your production into less ideal areas, and productivity will fall. That happens always in agriculture, and in mining, after a certain point. And then, if you also have products with little productivity increase, you get perfect international competition, wages that can be reversed, which now also happens in the West. And productivity increases are taken on as lower prices. If you read in the newspaper what you have to pay, what the market will pay for your goods, well, then you have perfect competition. That does not happen to Bill Gates. Bill Gates, when he sets his prices for his new products, he is pretty free to set these prices. Yes, competitors, but it's not perfect competition. Then you have low demand, low savings, low possibility for taxation, which leads to poor health and poor education. And investment in labor-saving technologies are unprofitable. This is very important. The scale of production is low. Imports tend to be cheaper because the foreigners have all these increasing returns. So even if they're higher wages, they can sell lower, right? And very little diversity, and you get low investments. Balance of the payment problems. Breakdown of the capacity to import. This is a classic one. This was a Brazilian economist in the 1950s who said that countries may suffer a breakdown of the capacity to import. The trade deficit grows and grows, and then in the end you cannot import. The children we talked about, and the low capital labor ratio. Low wages versus other nations, and you get a comparative advantage in labor-intensive activity. And this may start a vicious circle, which is in three steps: de-industrialization, de-agriculturalization, the loss of agriculture, and depopulation. Right? The three Ds. First you lose industry, then you lose manufacturing, and then you lose the population. Well, there's a classical case in Europe is Moldova. Classical case in Latin America is southern Mexico, right? And these vicious circles can be extremely vicious, but it's also possible to get out of them. And I think now the international setting is changing. I call this a moment similar to 1848. 1846 was the peak of the idea of free trade. It was the repeal of the Corn Laws in in England. But then the next year you had a huge financial crisis in England, and then you had a bad harvest in Europe from Finland to Spain. And in 1848 you had not only revolutions in all big European countries except Russia and England, but you also had three very important books. You had Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. You had a German by the name of Hildebrand who wrote the first book in the historical school tradition. Marx was so radical he had to flee from Germany to England. Hildebrand was so conservative he had to flee from Germany to Switzerland. So these people were all over the political map. And the third important book from 1848 was John Stuart Mill, the classical English liberalist, who recanted on free trade. He said that all countries need an infant industry protection. So even the arch-conservative English understood the importance of manufacturing. And I think now we are in an 1848 moment. So I'm not hoping for any revolutions, but I'm hoping for a change in mentality, like the change of mentality in 1848. Karl Marx is supposed to have said in a meeting in Brussels that he was very much in favor of free trade because premature free trade would create so much poverty that it would help revolution. Right? So if you understand that backward argument for protection, I think it's important. Well, these are, I think, the principles. How to apply these principles in specific context? Well, it is a different matter. But at least, hopefully, I have managed to outline some of the forces the economic forces at work. Thank you.